Hello and welcome to Breaking Culture Live. My name is Sean Johnson Andrews. I am the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association, and I'm broadcasting from Chicago. We're really pleased to welcome Dr. Jason Reed and Dr. Touré Reed. They're both excellent scholars and public intellectuals, and I hope we can touch on their research and writing. But I invited them here today to talk about the recently announced closure of Hampshire College, a small liberal arts school in Amherst, Massachusetts. Both are alumni and had formative experiences there. Jason Reed is professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine. He's the author of The Politics of Transindividuality, The Production of Subjectivity, Marx and Philosophy, and most recently, The Double Shift, Spinoza and Marx on Politics of Work, and a collection of his blog posts called Unemployed Negativity, which is also the name of the blog. So thanks for joining us, Jason.
Thank you.
And Dr. Touré Reed is professor of 20th century U.S. and Afro-American history at Illinois State University. His articles have been published in numerous journals, including the Journal of American Ethnic History, Labor, Non-Site, Jacobin, The Nation, Common Dreams, and The New Republic. He's author of Not Alms But Opportunity, The Urban League and the Politics of Racial Uplift, 1910 to 1950, and Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism, which is a Verso Books publication. And in 2021, he was named an outstanding college researcher. So, Dr. Reed, thank you for joining us and taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sean.
So, for those of you who don't know, Hampshire College enrolled its first students in 1970 on a model of critical pedagogy and student-led inquiry. And last week, the president and board announced that they will admit their final class of students this coming fall. So I wanted to talk about some of the structural problems and patterns that this closure kind of indicates. But since both of you went to the school, I hoped you could also first just tell us about your experience. So when did you attend and what did you think of that model? I'll let either of you jump in there.
You want to go first, Touré?
I'll let you go first.
Okay. So I attended Hampshire College from 91 to 94. I transferred in. I didn't know about Hampshire College when I first started looking at colleges, but I had a few friends who went. And by the time I had some experience of being at a state university, I was really hungry for the idea of a self-directed sort of major that Hampshire offered. So in many ways, my education, I was very happy with it in many ways. I liked the professors. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had interests in a lot of different things, anthropology, social theory, philosophy, sort of settled on philosophy towards the end. Um, I came at it, in the 90s. I was very involved in kind of punk and anarchist subcultures. That was a big part of my education there too. I was involved in like an anarchist reading group off campus. I was involved in like bringing music and publishing my own zine, and all those things sort of like all these things sort of intertwine sort of easily for me. The sort of idea of do-it-yourself culture of sort of escaping mainstream culture, but also an education that was modeled on that too. So even though Hampshire gets its model, it was a very 60s sort of thing. And there was, of course, a lot of that. There was a lot of the lingering sort of, hippie sort of culture. For me, it was like I was formed in a very sort of 90s kind of moment of rebellion against sort of mainstream commodification. And also, coming out of a strange sort of dissatisfaction. I in the 90s, you knew like Republican presidents my entire life. Reagan, the long shadow of Reagan, was
Sure.
something over us, and trying to figure out like an alternative to what seemed like a very dead mainstream, both politically and culturally.
Well, I guess it's my turn. I entered
Yeah.
Hampshire in 1988. I graduated in 1992. It was an institution I had been familiar with thanks to a family friend, Preston Smith, who was at that time when I was a kid, was a dean, I want to say, at Hampshire while he was wrapping up his dissertation, his doctorate at UMass Amherst. So when I was about 12 or 13, I'd begun to spend some time on Hampshire's campus. I suppose that's one of the luxuries of being a faculty brat. I had an opportunity to spend a lot of time on myriad college campuses from basically day one of my life. And I fell in love with Amherst. I mean, I thought Amherst was a great college town, and it's not someplace I would have wanted to live at any other stretch of my life. Certainly after I didn't. And before I'd grown up in Atlanta, Georgia, and New Haven, Connecticut, which is where I'd gone to high school. And there just was something very appealing about being, for me, at 15, 16, 17, and certainly 18 through 21, being in a college community, in a college town. The curriculum at Hampshire was probably not the first thing on my mind at 16, but
Sure.
once I had plugged into the college, I really loved the curriculum. I loved the structure of the institution, and it did have a structure, to be clear, but it was a structure that was very different from the highly institutionalized bureaucratic structure of the public high schools that I had attended in Connecticut, which were stifling. So there was something quite liberating about the Hampshire curriculum, of course. The faculty were wonderful. And one of the nice things about the relationship between students and faculty at an institution like Hampshire, that's quite distinct from a place where I work, which is a large public university, where the dynamics are shaped very much by bureaucracy. There is no dividing line between the people who guided me intellectually and the people who guided me through the curriculum. They were one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that paid immeasurable dividends, because my faculty advisors and I developed personal relationships that were bound up with my intellectual interests. And it was clear to me, both intellectually and with the long run of of what proved to be my professional aspirations, that they had my best interests at heart. And they were quite inspiring in that regard. I want to throw out one of the long-term positives about Hampshire, and it's certainly not something that most 15 or 16-year-olds would consider. And I didn't consider it much when I was 18, to be perfectly honest, but Hampshire had a reputation for producing a very large percentage of graduates who went on to doctoral programs. I think when I was in grad school at Columbia, Hampshire was in the top 25 of institutions whose graduates went on to doctoral programs. Mm-hmm. History, it was number one, interestingly enough. And I think even after the restructuring, Hampshire continued to maintain the reputation, so that it was, or the track record, I should say. So it was in the top 40 up until the waning days. And largely in scholarly disciplines. The last thing I'll say on this front, that when people think of liberal arts colleges, I think they tend to think of arts and humanities and maybe social sciences. But Hampshire's programs in the natural sciences, and the School of Communications and Cognitive Sciences, as it was called back in my day, the faculty and curriculum was very strong, and that was evinced by the large number of graduates who went on to doctoral programs in the sciences as well. There were things that I wasn't crazy about Hampshire, with respect to Hampshire, but we can come back to that. On the whole, it was a really great educational experience.
So, when you talk about the curriculum, maybe can either of you give a kind of potted description of what that curriculum looked like? What was unique about the way that the curriculum worked at Hampshire?
Now, it changed over the years, but when I was there were 3 units: Division 1, Division 2, Division 3. It has nothing to do with sports. And Div 1 would be the equivalent of doing what's your gen eds, right? Your foundational requirements and the discrete units. And in my day, and it was a little different before I entered, and they changed this afterward. But in my day, one would fulfill at least half of those Division 1 curriculum requirements by taking 2 courses within each field. There was a natural science exception. One had to complete a project for natural sciences, but you could, if you were disposed, complete all 4 requirements. And I think eventually it might have been 5. I don't remember. It changed sometime after I graduated, but one could hypothetically complete all 4 of those requirements by doing projects in each discrete unit. And that's how it had been before I entered. That it naturally hung up a lot of 18 to 19-year-olds. It could be daunting, despite the best efforts of the very engaged faculty. But that's Div 1. Div 2 you could think of as the course curriculum within your major. And in that process, one would take whatever courses one worked out with one's advisors that would put you on whatever intellectual trajectory and or professional trajectory you wanted to chart. And again, that would be probably some combination of coursework and maybe projects, independent projects and the like. And then finally, Div 3 was your final intellectual project, whatever that would be. So for people in the social sciences and probably most of the humanities, that would likely consist of what most would know as a senior essay. Outside of those fields, there might be particular projects, music compositions, dance compositions, etc. And there was no way to graduate without completing a project of that sort. And the way that I often described Hampshire to people I knew who were interested, either as prospective students or people who were just unfamiliar with it, is that Hampshire was kind of like preparatory school for doctoral programs. And that became crystal clear to me when I answered my doctoral program in history at Columbia. And because it encourages you to think outside of the box, but in a way that necessarily requires intellectual rigor or artistic rigor, whatever your discipline, under the guidance of supervisors, right, who point you in the direction you need to go. And of course, afforded students the skill sets they would need, both soft and hard, to do doctoral level work, notably independent research. And last thing I'll say on this front, I had the great luck my last year of college when I would have completed my senior essay, which was in some part on underclass ideology and the Great Migration, looking at Chicago. My good fortune was not that topic by itself, but that my father and his then wife had left Yale, where they were professors in the social sciences, for Northwestern, which put them in Chicago metro area. So I was able to spend, just before my last year in college, so I was able to find a crash pad in Chicagoland, which equipped me to do actual research at libraries, low rent archival research. It was not the kind of archival research I would do even for my master's or equivalent of master's thesis, but it was a nice warm-up act for that. And I had the luxury with Hampshire's curriculum to spend pretty much my entire 4th year working on this project, which translated into, an 80 to 100 page thesis, which paid pretty useful dividends when applying to graduate programs.
Jason, what was your experience? I think both of you said something about not being any grades, and this has come up quite a bit in the coverage. Certainly, like the Republican or GOP right wing critique is that, well, of course it went under. They didn't have grades. They weren't preparing students because you didn't have any.
Yeah, that
feedback.
that is one of the things that I think it's most misrepresented, because what you got in place of a grade was a narrative evaluation. It was a couple paragraphs long about the entire course you took. And in many ways, it was much more constructive than a grade. It could, in some sense, be like harsher. Like, I remember I got a narrative evaluation which basically said I needed to learn how not to dominate class discussion so much. It was included in there because I was in my like heady kind of like high theory phase, and I was just like, and yeah, I was a bit of that, like, it's like that Onion article, like, guy in philosophy class needs to shut the fuck up. That was pretty much me. And I remember showing that to my parents and them being very like frustrated about that. And but it was honest, it was true. And a grade would not have communicated something like that. It would not have communicated. I mean, as someone who deals with grades now all the time, you're aware of how poor of an indicator they are of actual progress. And a narrative is so much more substantial and so much more honest about what one has done and gone through. Now, of course, there are issues. They don't necessarily allow people to be ranked in the same way. Um,
which is
but
a real problem under
yeah,
our
exactly.
culture. We need to know
Yeah.
who's on top.
No, no, yeah, exactly.
Um, yeah, in a blog post from 2019, when Hampshire was having some earlier trouble, you said you said it felt like it was not only the future that was being canceled, but the present as well.
Hmm.
You said it was like, quote, watching one's very own conditions of possibility disappear, and you compared it to that scene in Looper, which I admit just haunts me to this day.
Yeah.
that that scene. Um, that's probably like the thing that stands out to me. It's almost the only thing I remember about that movie. Um,
Mhm.
but both of you have had several other levels of education and years of experience since graduation. So how does your experience at Hampshire continue to inform your teaching and learning?
I'll begin this by affirming something that Jason said. I was conflicted about the grading system at Hampshire, the fact that there were no grades. And I spent, like a lot of my friends who had ambitions to go to doctoral programs or work at law school, I spent a fair amount of time as an undergrad trying to figure out if this was an A, an A minus, or a B plus. When I read my
Mhm.
course evaluations, and those course evaluations were, of course, as Jason said, very detailed and offered real insights into what students were and were not doing, like the strengths and um, extant deficiencies that may not have been the biggest deal in the world, but certainly called those to the attention of the recipients. Even though I was a little conflicted in real time about the lack of grades at Hampshire, um, one, I want to reiterate that right wing critique is just wrongheaded. Two, for reasons I've already alluded to, that only amplifying what Jason had said. Two, one of the reasons that it's wrongheaded is it takes a hell of a lot of time from the vantage point of the professor
Oh yeah, I can
to
only imagine.
put
Mhm.
together the student
Hmm.
assessments. I'm going to connect this in 1 second to the specific question that you asked me, Sean, but it takes a lot of time to do that. It's really important for faculty to do that, though.
Mhm.
If the point of education is to educate, simply giving a student an A, B, C, D, or heaven forbid F, and moving on um, will not achieve that goal. Giving a student that kind of letter grade, even with comments in the margins of papers that read awkward or unclear and nothing else, will not allow those students to progress in the way that we would like them to as instructors. And this is a long-winded way to say that as a professor, and I had this experience even as a grad assistant at Columbia, but as a professor at a large enough public university, I feel the ghost of Hampshire haunting me every time I have students submit papers. And this is a
Mhm.
good ghost. It's a friendly ghost. It's Casper, I suppose. And it has informed, very much in a positive, an affirmative way, the importance, my pedagogy, not just with something as simple as being sure to write a lot of comments on papers, giving students guidance, not just final comments, but comments in the body of essays. A commitment to having students write essays too, rather
Mhm.
than multiple choice exams. Now, AI has complicated this in ways that we may get to, but
Yeah.
so far, without much caveat, uh, essays that are take-home exams or longer papers is what I generally have students write at this stage in my career and have since I was tenured back in 2007. And just as importantly, within the classroom itself, for all of my 100, 200, or sorry, my 200 and 300 level courses, So courses for majors and minors at the 200 level, and advanced courses for majors at the 300 level. The classroom atmosphere that I try to create, even in a large public university, uh, is approximates what I got at Hampshire. And I'll just give one example. We have the good fortune at ISU of being able to blend the positives of a large public university with the positives of a liberal arts college. So our largest classes within the history department clock in around 25 or 30 students. Now that's way larger than most of the classes I took at Hampshire. I think the largest courses I took at Hampshire, which would have been two, had about 30 students, which constituted a lecture course at Hampshire, right? Most had, a dozen or fewer, right? And what I do is I break down my class of 30 into chunks of 15, and we have discussion on readings and the like, and recorded lectures, right? I still lecture, but I don't lecture in person anymore, because I want to connect with the students, right? And I can see what they're getting and what they're not getting. And it's very much informed by the curriculum that I had the benefit of at Hampshire, ensuring that students take a more direct, personal, hands-on approach to their own education. And that's essential if college is to function like middle-class people, or people who can afford it anyway, a gentle segue to adulthood. Then we want them to be independent thinkers, right? We want them to be critical thinkers who are capable of working independently, I should say, not just to ensure a competent white collar workforce, but as the foundational work to a properly functioning democracy. We need people to have context. We need people to be able to think critically, and of course, to think not just in the classroom, but to think about the big issues that we cover in the classroom in their free time. And I think the best way to do that is to do, from an educator standpoint anyway, is to do something on the spectrum of what the Hampshire College model, required.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like there'd also be a very, it's about that relationship between faculty and students, actually knowing the student enough to write a long reflection, like you just mentioned, Jason, that, that requires attention to the student that goes beyond just looking at what happened on the page.
And Jason, I don't know if you have this experience, but, and maybe my perspective has evolved over the years of professing, but I find it really a lot. It's very easy for me to write the detailed comments, like, and to explain what the good, the bad, and the ugly of an essay were. I got no problem with that. The hard part is condensing that into A, B, C, D, or F. Well, F is easy, but A, B, C. That is the hard part, because I don't think that A, B, C always effectively capture, what's happening here. It feels almost arbitrary to me at this point. What about you?
Yeah, no, exactly. It's strange because in some sense I have very little experience with grades before coming into teaching, because I was at Hampshire. Although when I was at Hampshire, I did take advantage of the fact that you could take classes at other colleges. I took classes at Amherst, at Smith, and Mount Holyoke while I was there. In some sense, took advantage of the fact that those schools offered broader survey type classes that Hampshire didn't have. Hampshire had highly specialized. People were often teaching their research, which was great. But if you wanted a survey of philosophy from this period to that period, or a survey of political theory, that's where I went to other colleges for. But I didn't have much experience with grades. And then, of course, grad school has grades, but not really, because everyone is expected to be doing A-level work. So they, so learning how to apply a grade to things is very strange, coming from that. And like Tori said, it's like I can write the comments, but then I have to translate them into a grade, which I can only do by thinking about the overall student, is it
Yep.
their best work, etc. What am I trying to tell them with this? But it's very difficult, and it is like said, it's like this ghost haunts me. Ghost haunts me around grading. The other place the ghost haunts me is I tend to do a lot of independent studies because I've really sort of taken on this idea that if a student has an idea about something they want to study, the last thing you should say to them is, I'm sorry, no one offers a course in that, or no, that can't be offered this semester, or whatever the case may be. Like the student should be driving their own education. So if someone comes to me, and if it's, unless it's something that's like completely way outside of anything I know anything about, if someone comes to me and they say, I really want to learn about X, chances are I will say, okay, yeah, let's do that. Um, and because I feel like an education should be more like that than handing someone a checklist of telling them what they need to complete to know what they need to know.
Yeah.
I love that you mentioned surveys because I don't know if you've had this experience, Jason, but I did not get that at Hampshire, as you say. That would have been an off-campus experience, and I only took musicology off campus. But I actually came to appreciate the value of surveys, which I had disregarded as an undergraduate.
Hmm.
But when I was in grad school, I thought, oh, there is something to having an occasional lecture that in a course with a broad scope that gives you a kind of foundation on which to build that those particular courses
Hmm.
that will enrich one's understanding of the material covered in particular courses. So there were things in terms of the curriculum that Hampshire offered that maybe could have been a little more traditional, but I
Hmm.
don't think and at least one of the larger lectures I took at Hampshire lectures was a survey, but not really, because it was a Hampshire survey. And again, I think
Hmm.
there are some benefits to a more traditional to elements of a more
Hmm.
traditional education.
Well, so part of the reason for talking about this closure is to think about this or to talk about it as a sort of bellwether of many other changes afoot. The Hessinger report, which has stopped tracking this since 2023, but they recorded between 2008 and 2023, 300 colleges and universities closed.
Hmm.
Um, about 60% of those were private for-profit schools, which that sector certainly took a hit earlier. But NPR reported in December that there are another 442 private nonprofit four-year colleges that are at risk of being forced to close or merge. This is from a report by Huron Consulting Group, which we can take that with a grain of salt, since probably part of what they're doing is consulting those colleges on how to merge and close. Uh, but um, but even major universities are instituting dramatic cuts in their faculty, particularly in the humanities and liberal arts. And almost all of the dominant conversation about this trend focuses on the demographic cliffs, the economics of higher ed. But what do you all see when you look at this? When you look at both the dominant trends and what's happening at Hampshire?
Yeah, I mean, the loss of Hampshire feels obviously feels different to me because I went there, but it also feels different to me in the sense that I know that it met a particular kind of need for a particular kind of student, right? Students who would not be comfortable or happy at a more traditional college or university. And it's hard to think about where those students will go
Right.
now without Hampshire. Um, and in some sense, I mean, people don't ask this so much to me about undergrad, but you get this question, from students, where did you go to school? Because it's in some sense the question, like when someone's like, oh, what you do is interesting. I want to know how I can sort of reproduce that or do something similar. And I've, had two blows because my graduate program, the Philosophy, Interpretation, and Culture program at SUNY Binghamton closed years ago and was kind of transformed, and now Hampshire's closed. So there's a sense in which, like, if someone asked, like, how can I learn the things or I don't want to make it sound like someone wants to be me, but have a similar kind of experience. It's like I don't know what to say to them anymore because both the undergraduate institution that really shaped me and the graduate institution that really shaped me have, which were both in their own ways experimental, interdisciplinary in some ways, uh, have been closed. And so it is a question of, you know, where are we going to reproduce a certain type of inquiry when the institutions that support it are shutting down?
Yeah, I think you mentioned this in a recent blog post talking about the reproductive rift. Um, this is you're taking this from a book that Annie McClanahan wrote about, mostly about gig workers, but you're kind of taking it to not only the kind of reproduction of people's everyday life through food, clothing, and shelter, but the reproduction of a sort of generation of critical thinking scholars. So we saw the New School and University of Chicago are two of the most prominent schools that have said they'll no longer enroll PhD students in the humanities,
Hmm.
making the current generation of faculty one of the last. So I don't know. It seems like there's something to flesh out here with the concept of the reproductive rift. Um, and maybe is it too dramatic to see all these attacks on higher education as an attempt to prevent the sort of next generation of critical thinkers?
Yeah, I mean, so much of education is about this, it is kind of an apprenticeship. It's about this reproduction, right? That professors are trying to turn you from a student to a fellow researcher to a scholar, right? That's the process. And and as Troy was saying earlier, one of the things that's unique about Hampshire is to some extent that happens a lot sooner, right? That to some extent at Hampshire, you are um, doing your own research a lot earlier than you would at other institutions, and in some sense you're beginning to model at least some of these behaviors of being a peer earlier than you might. And I definitely echo what he said about preparation for graduate school. I mean, I showed up to graduate school and a lot of my professors and peers assumed that I had at least an MA, but I just had a BA from Hampshire College. So much of education is about that. And now it literally is being dismantled in the sense that, I don't know what to do when, it's a very painful experience when students want to talk to me about graduate school because I don't know, I know why they're saying what they're saying and their interest and their passion, but I try to discourage them, not discourage them, but I try to be honest with them about what the future entails. But, that's a hard message for everyone to hear because, you know, we all want to believe that even if the chances are slight, that we might be the one to make it
Sure.
through. Um,
I want to echo a lot of what Jason said. And I'll begin by mentioning a fun anecdote. Well, it's not so fun, actually. The day, the day before Hampshire's closure, or at least the announcement of Hampshire's closure, I should say, I Googled, is Hampshire College closing? And what I saw on the website was, and Google, among other places it took me, was to the website, to Hampshire's website, and it indicated the day before, in no uncertain terms, that Hampshire was on a firm footing. And then in less than 24 hours, we get this notice. Now, the fact that I Googled in the first place, coincided, that question is the first sign that there was a problem that was obviously on the horizon, and apparently closer than I had realized or whatever. But I want to go back to 2019 and the restructuring. I don't know if Jason had this feeling, but I had soured very much on Hampshire around the restructuring in 2019. And for me, if they had to restructure, they'd restructure. That wasn't the issue. The issue was the timing of the announcement. And the timing of the announcement would have been at a point where cert cycles for faculty would have already concluded, because I think it was
mhm,
January.
mhm.
And my first thought as an alum who went on to, a doctoral program and became an academic, was about the sacrifices that the faculty would have to make, with respect to their research profile. in order to teach the Hampshire curriculum. And I felt that the college had done them dirty, basically by not announcing the restructuring plan before hiring cycles would have kicked in. I mean, I wasn't donating money after that. I was pissed that the college did that to the faculty. The faculty are often not part of the mix in these discussions, and I have a similar reaction to the news of the closure too, because this is well after all searches for every discipline would have closed. And I thought, well, I mean, it sucks for the students, but they're young, they'll find another college. The faculty, by contrast, are going to have a hell of a hard time applying to trade as scholars in general. But in this context, they're going to have to go a year, right, without employment in their chosen profession that they spent probably from college forward, working on this particular career trajectory. So I just wanted to throw that out there. The matter of reproduction, I think, is really interesting. And I should say that part of the reason that I had searched Hampshire's closure, apart from the restructuring, is the attack on, liberal arts education generally, right? Both the decline of the institutions, but the decline of the institutions themselves, and majors within all institutions, right, in humanities and social sciences, is part of a broader cultural trend that does include the alleged uselessness of critical thinking. I mean, it's never framed as the uselessness of critical thinking, right? But No Child Left Behind wasn't called Most Children Left Behind for a reason. Few of us would co-sign that. But this is a bipartisan problem. I was just talking to my students in one of my courses the other day about President Obama's disposition to piss on art history as a major, for example. It suggested that such majors are a waste of time. And instead, maybe you should major in something that translates automatically into a job, right? So basically treating college as white collar professional work. There's a white collar professional vocational training is what it is, right? And there's definitely a class component to that narrative. I would bet cash money that President Obama went to Harvard Law with a lot more art history majors than he would have, gone to Harvard Law with criminal justice majors or kinesiology majors, right? Two fields that would translate on some level to automatic employment. But in art history, one does the critical thinking that one needs to do as an attorney, heaven forbid. But again, crucially, to be a responsible citizen in a democratic society. And I think the problem that Hampshire's closure announces, again, part and parcel of these larger cultural and political trends, is a commitment to and this is, again, a bipartisan commitment, but a commitment to a model of education that is not like Dewey or even Thomas Jefferson, heaven forbid, which again presume that a properly functioning democracy needs an educated citizenry. Instead, we have all attached ourselves to a vision of education that's human capital theory. And there's no way that you can easily sell, history or philosophy. Both are great majors if you want to be a lawyer, for example, but those are people who are outside of the mix. There's no way you can sell history, philosophy, anthropology, English as providing the kind of foundational education that one will need for employers. Now, that's up to AI anyway. That's been wrongheaded, but it's a hard sell, particularly though for an institution like Hampshire that costs, I think, $80,000 a year, with inclusive of room and board, that has no grades, and that 18-year-olds, generally speaking, won't walk in saying, you know what I want to do? I want to be a philosophy professor, or I want to be a history professor, right? I mean, that is a real value of Hampshire, but it's just not the best sell to a 17 or 18-year-old, particularly in a context in which education is really more about employment, period, and less about educating citizens.
Any comment on? I guess you've already kind of spoken to that, Jason. I'm sort of struck by this question then. I think back to in his book After Theory, Terry Eagleton, he talks about the student uprisings in the 60s and 70s, and kind of attributes this to there being more people who weren't usually able to get a higher ed degree because of uh, restrictions were obstacles based on race, gender, class, nationality, were in these institutions. And he said something to the effect of this was recognized as a mistake that the elites wouldn't make again.
Mm.
And since that time, we've seen the collapse of public financial support for higher education, particularly at the state and federal level. And these recent attacks from the Trump administration on this sort of specter of DEI or whatever that means, and especially kind of any programs or admissions policies addressing gender, race, ethnicity, and I don't know where Hampshire kind of fits into this, uh, but it's certainly the case that this the overall reaction to the attacks on higher ed seems to be sort of like, so what, or we didn't need it, or that was a problem anyway. um so I don't know, what do you make of the larger culture basically just letting higher ed take these attacks and die? Because that seems to be the larger reaction.
Yeah, well, it does seem to be. I mean, I do think that one of the things, and I say this to my classes a lot, I say, because I teach at a regional public university. A lot of my students come from working class backgrounds. A lot of them are currently working while they're in school. And I say to them in a philosophy class that the one thing that probably most of the philosophers we read, especially the big canon ones, not all of them, uh, would have never imagined is that a bunch of working class people will be studying this. They never imagined a sort of democratization of the institution of philosophy. They thought it would have been for people who, going back to Plato, for the people who have the time and the resources, the elites, right? And so I think it is interesting to think, and the reason I frame it in that way is that um, because it's so rarely framed in this way, that to some extent the attack on higher education is an attack on this breakthrough or a series of successive breakthroughs where people who were excluded from an activity have been included, right?
Hmm.
People from diverse backgrounds of class, race, gender, etc. But the the language of this assault on this sort of process of democratization is framing it to some extent in their own interest, right? Through job training, right? Because what they need, right? This is back to what Touré was saying about Obama and art history, right? What people really need is something marketable, right? That's the
Mm.
response. So in some sense, it is, I mean, it's sort of this kind of neoliberalism from below, right? That because of the insecurity and vulnerability people feel about the possibility of finding employment that would be at all, you know, would heal that reproductive rift, make it possible for them to live their own lives. Uh, the assault on education is being presented not as an assault on these sort of victories of access and opportunity, but an assault on these, superfluous and pointless, majors, which to some extent at Hampshire, we've been in the front lines of that since the very beginning. I was doing some research before we talked this morning, and first of all, Hampshire has a pretty good website as far as like they were posting articles wherever Hampshire showed up for a while. It's hard to search it, but I found like a 1991 article from the Wall Street Journal about some dispute over some faculty who were perceived as being not like attuned to critical matters of race and colonialism, etc. This is an intra-academic debate, and it's picked up in the Wall Street Journal in 1991. I mean, and to some extent, it was called PC then. We're calling it DEI now, but it was the same kind of assault, really.
Yeah.
And Hampshire has been there, at the front of this for so long.
Yeah,
I want to,
yeah. I was wondering. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I was wondering about you. What you might think about that, Touré.
I wanted to add another layer of texture to what Jason was getting at, and I think part of the problem here that universities are facing is maybe the upward migration of the war on teachers finally making its way to universities and of course faculty predictably. And this isn't to uncouple it from the culture wars, because I think they're connected issues. But if we've been selling education as a panacea to precarity and other societal problems, which we've been doing since the Johnson administration, at all levels, but primarily primary and secondary, and then of course college subsequently. And by this point, the college degree, which costs a lot of money, thanks to the underfunding, thanks in large part to cuts to public universities. So now students spend a very large chunk of money on a 4-year degree, not just to go to elite universities, which are unconscionably expensive, but oftentimes, the public university in their own state. I think University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, for example, the flagship institution in Illinois, with tuition and room and board, has to be about $40,000 a year or something like that. In 1968, it was about $350 a year with tuition and room and board. And while there's been a lot of inflation, there hasn't been that much. I think it would be closer to 3,500 if spending had remained constant, right? If costs had remained constant. And where I teach, I think costs close to $30,000 a year with tuition and room and board, right? But students are spending a lot of money for colleges and for college educations that they had been told, college students have been told since before Jason and I were in college, that would insulate them from the vagaries of capitalism. And it's just not true, right? It was always, going to be an inadequate policy prescription for precarity, because the college degree, with the exception of degrees in specialty fields like chemistry, for everything outside of the purview of those kinds of fields, the value of the college degree was owed to a good extent to scarcity. So if you treat as policy for redressing precarity college, access to college, at the same time policymakers are cutting funding to colleges and expenses go up, then what's going to happen is the value of the degree is going to decline, right? And the cost is going to be, the burden of the expense is going to be borne by the students. Well, people are angry about that. And, on some level, college professors and school teachers before us are just the latest expression of the welfare queens that the Reagan administration insisted was banking, and I shouldn't just pin this on Reagan because it's a bipartisan thing anyway, but there were neoliberal Republicans and Democrats insisted we're bankrupting America one out of wedlock pregnancy at a time. Well, again, that's public school teachers by W, and it's us by now. And, it's just more scapegoating. I think that's a big part of the problem. I mean, I think that complements that aspect of the story, complements what Jason was saying.
Well, both of you also have mentioned AI, which also seems to be like one of the, I don't even know how to describe it. It's not even a wild card. It's just sort of like the God in the machine that's supposed to explain everything. But there's especially the hype around its possibilities. I don't think, not AI itself, although certainly, as you mentioned before, Touré, having students use it or seeing the results of their kind of asking AI is certainly part of it. But where do you think this fits into that decline in support for higher ed?
Well, I think one of the reasons is what Tori was saying too, is that like one of the strange things about the way higher ed's been positioned as a solution to class precarity and as the means for upward mobility is that, that solution, which has its own internal problems. Tori was saying, if you make everyone a business major, you're going to devalue the value of the business major degree, right? But at the same time, beyond those internal contradictions, there's also the fact that the job market and the situation of jobs is itself subject to its own economic, technological transformations, of which AI is possibly a big one. I mean, there have been some effects so far, it seems to me, of AI of eliminating some of the entry level jobs which college graduates used to go into, right? Like it might pose to be more of a threat to things like paralegals and those sorts of work than other types of work. I don't know. I don't want to get involved in the hype, but so on the one hand, there is a way in which it is kind of de-skilling some of the supposed skills that used to be seen as sort of, you know, as outside of that, right? That would always be valuable, right? And the sort of like Robert Reich sort of idea about what you need higher education for. So there's that aspect, and it is contributing to the devaluation of higher education. But the other irony here, when we're talking about Hampshire, is that because everyone's struggling to come up with an AI-proof model of education, and Hampshire really already had an AI-proof model of education. I mean, I don't think you could go through a Hampshire education having AI write your assignments for you. It just wouldn't work, given the independent nature, given the one-on-one discussions, given it just wouldn't work in any way, shape, or form. Now, of course, it's not a model that can be reproduced on a large scale because it is so expensive, because it involves so much faculty time and so on. But there's a certain irony that the very thing that is kind of an antidote to the problem is being dismantled at the same
Mm.
time people are confronting the problem.
Um, you know, I deal with a lot of AI assisted papers, and this is where I could imagine students using AI in a Hampshire curriculum, but they wouldn't be getting their money's worth, which is a different matter. Culturally, it seems that many students have a different take on what it means to use AI than, let's say, many professors do. So I've had a number of instances where students who had clearly used AI and copped to it, despite the fact that I have a zero tolerance policy for it,
Mm-hmm.
didn't imagine that they had used AI, even though they told me they did. But they didn't imagine they used AI because they had AI write the first draft of their paper and then they wrote their draft off of it, or the reverse, that, that they wrote
Mm.
their first draft and they had AI spruce it up. And no matter how you slice it, they used AI and it was undercutting their abilities to really write effectively, right? I mean, because it was discouraging them from developing that skill set. I would also submit that the process of writing refines one's thought about issues as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? Irrespective of whether or not it's typing it at a keyboard or writing it by hand, that process of writing offers clarity in one's thought. Um, from my vantage point, and this is maybe what I was kind of waving at badly when I referenced President Obama and pissing on art history as a major, that it just strikes me that there's a bifurcation of what we expect from education. That we expect, it's not new, but now it's pretty acute at this point. We expect elites to be well educated, and what we don't want for the masses is a broad liberal arts kind of education. What we want for the masses is something more, and we is no one involved in this conversation,
Sure.
but what policymakers and partisans on payroll seem to want is masses who have an education geared toward employment, period. And I would submit, as much as this feels like a dystopian sci-fi novel or every third episode of the Twilight Zone, that that helps with compliance, right? There's a degree of ignorance
Yeah.
that helps with compliance, and one expression of this is how few Americans know that, let's say, what Bernie Sanders was championing in 2016 and 2020 with regard to his calls for taxpayer-funded, tuition-free public higher education. That's not new, right? That
Yeah.
was how public education had been conceived going back to the Republican Party of Lincoln, right? The point of it was for it to be, if not free, affordable. The barrier to access would not be economic. The barrier to access would be whether or not one had the interest or aptitude for it. But if one did have the interest in aptitude, then public universities were there for you. Well, we've been moving away from that for about as long as Jason and I have been alive. And now we're at the point where the chickens have very much come home to roost, and we're paying a price for it as a nation. And I won't point to any electoral outcomes that drive home, or foreign policy, endeavors that drive home the price that we're all paying for an embrace of a purely human capital driven model of education that's financed by user fees. But that's where we are. And it doesn't bode well, not just for Hampshire. I mean, Hampshire, in the best case scenario, would be a mine canary. And there were plenty of other mine canaries before it. But it does not bode well for this nation, and by extension, the globe, given this nation's global reach.
Well, I did want to mention something about the faculty. I know that the faculty that have been dismissed, I think there's 250 folks who work at Hampshire, and they are not receiving any severance. So I'll make sure to put in the show notes. There's some notes for our website they've launched to contribute to their fund. But that's a whole other element of this that's really disturbing and unfortunate.
Yeah, especially given what Touré said about the timing of this, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the faculty are looking at the possibility really of getting hired in fall of 2027 as a best case scenario. So the having to go that long without any kind of severance or support is ridiculous. And of course, it affects people who, I don't know the specifics of the situation, but there were probably people who were very much committed to the idea of Hampshire and sticking with it for as long as they could because of their students. And I should say, going back to what you said earlier, it's not that they're admitting their last class in the fall. The fall is the last semester that Hampshire is going to exist at all. They're existing only in the fall, supposedly to let students finish out their programs. It's unclear who's going to make the cut, but it's going to be for a small number of students, and probably a smaller number of faculty will be held on just so some people can graduate. It's very unclear, and it must be incredibly anxiety provoking for both students and faculty who don't know where they are in this whole situation, and what it's going to be like to be there in this fall kind of like tomb of an institution.
Not as many friendly ghosts, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Well, I know it's cliche to end with Lennon's question, but if either of you have a sense of what is to be done, we have a minute.
Well, that feels like a question that the philosopher should take first stab at.
I don't know. Labor historian seems like another key voice here.
Well, to go back to what something Touré said earlier, I think that so many of the problems in higher education would be solved if higher education was treated as a public good and publicly funded. I mean, we would see everything that's happening in terms of, right now we're in this sort of downward spiral where because of the human capital version of things, people are enrolling less and less in schools like Hampshire or in majors like philosophy, history, etc. Everything about that would change if it was not this, what it's become, this incredibly risky, debt-laden investment in one's future, and was actually a publicly supported aspect of a democratic society. So, I mean, it's what is to be done is one simple thing in theory, harder in practice, but
Sure.
to restore education as a public good, publicly funded public good.
And to add to that, since I would co-sign everything Jason said, to get to that end, that requires political organization and a different form of education, as to organize people around a return to a model of governance that's centered on, a democratic vision for that required the government to provide public goods. Right. I mean, that's the American middle class was built on some version of that, and we can do that better today, thanks in part to the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the like. But we can do that. We could do that better today.
Well, hopefully we can start tomorrow, if not today. But thanks so much for joining us, both of you. I appreciate hearing about your experiences and your insights as to what this canary's death means. So next week we'll be talking with the leadership of the Dads Foundation, which recently produced the documentary The Dads. If you're joining us on the YouTube channel, it'll be streaming here again. This episode will also be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel, so please share it with your colleagues and let us know if you have any ideas for future episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com. Thanks again for joining us. Again, I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com. Until next time, take care.